Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming General Stan McChrystal and Admiral Joe Maguire to discuss on character.
Well, General Stan McChrystal, welcome to Texas.
Well, after Bill's comments, I feel like anything I say is going to detract from my stature.
I was thinking the same thing. We ought to just quit right there.
Exactly.
You know? Well, Stan, on character. I know you had a working title that you were thinking about before that, but what was the genesis of On Character, and why did you write this book?
Yeah, it's a fair question. When I left the service, and we haven't raised that yet, I left suddenly in the summer of 2010, and I was not going to write anything. And so people came to me and they said, "You need to write your memoirs." And I said, "No, I don't." Then they said, "You have a debt to history." And I said, "No, I don't have a debt to history." Then they said, "We'll pay you money." All right. So we wrote my memoirs, which was really a cathartic effort because you really study what you've done and you see it from a different perspective. It's also humbling because the closer you get to reality as you study it, it's not quite as burnished as you remember it yourself. But we wrote that and then wrote 3 other books that interested me, one on risk, one on some historical leaders. And I was through writing books. And Annie and I like to sit in our living room and read. That's what we do. And so we'd sit in these 2 chairs, and every 15 or 20 minutes, I would interrupt her, and I'd say, "I have a brilliant idea about some issue." And she'd sort of pick up for a second, and she'd look at me, and she'd listen, and then she'd nod, and okay, go back. And then one day she said, "Stop telling me this, write them down." So I started writing these essays on just every subject I could think of, and it was good because you can think something about a subject, but if you have to write 800 or 1,000 words about it and make an argument to yourself that's credible, sometimes you find out what you thought you think isn't that. But anyway, so I worked on these, and the first title was going to be What I Think About the Things I Think About. Why are you laughing? It's a good title. And I was excited about it, and Annie just immediately she says, "That's absurd." And I said, "Well, I'll talk to the publisher." And he goes, "That's absurd." So anyway, and then as we started looking at the book, I realized that all of the essays intersect on something I've been thinking about for the last 15 years. And that's a question of character. And I've been thinking about it more and more. Maybe as I get older, you get the perspective of life. But suddenly, it became clear to me that what I was thinking about, what I wanted to write about, what I wanted to explore, and what I wanted to invite other people to explore was a question of character. Because I don't think in that book I have any answers for anyone. But I think I have come up with some good questions for me. And I would urge people, if they explore those questions for themselves, I think it might be of value.
You've got the McChrystal Group. You give speeches. You lead a very, very busy life. How did you find the time to write this book? And how can others carve out space for their reflection?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think everybody's got a different style in when they write. I can't sit and write for 15 minutes and get anything. I have to have about 3 hours in a block before I can produce anything where my mind is really starting to work. So I tended to write in the evenings after work, sitting in that chair. Okay, I couldn't read. And then on weekends. And then the other great time is when you travel a lot. Planes are a great place. Planes, trains, automobiles, where you aren't interrupted by calls. You can sit down and you can do it. And the way I like to write is I like to write something that is literally about a 30% solution. And then I will just keep iterating on it. And sometimes it will be completely different from when I started. But I need that first thing to start from to get myself going.
You call character the most accurate and last full measure of who we choose to be. Why does character matter?
Yeah, I'm going to push on this one a little bit because I just think it's so important. You know, Tom Paine, the pamphleteer, said that reputation is what men think of us. character is what gods and angels know of us. And I think he was right. I think character is the essence of who we are. Who we are is not how tall we are, how smart we are. It is the essence of our values. It's best measured by what we do, not by what we say, not by what we write, not by what we might even try to convince ourselves. It's reflected ultimately in what we do. And I came up with an equation because I was trained as an engineer and it just seemed right. I came to believe that character is really a product of two things. It's the product of our convictions. Those are our deeply held beliefs. Things that, not things we've just seen and heard and we accept, but things we've pressure tested. Things that are very important and we're willing to live to them or maybe to die for them. But then the other part of the equation is our self-discipline. Because you can have the best convictions in the world, but if you don't have the discipline to live up to it, anything times zero is zero. And so what I would argue is those two are equally important. And we've got to nurture first what our convictions, what we decide they will be, and they won't all be the same. But then working on the discipline to actually live to them, I think, may be the harder task.
Yeah. Well, I was very impressed with the mathematical formula, and it does make sense. But Stan, in the book, you emphasize the danger of performative virtue, especially in high visibility organizations like the military. How can leaders cultivate authentic character in their units when the modern information environment pushes people towards optics, branding, and personal narrative management?
Yeah. I don't think this is brand new because I think back in history, if we think back in military leaders, there was a tendency to get yourself in the best looking uniform you have, stand up straight, go address the troops and whatnot. So there was a performative part to it. And in some cases, there was a separation between senior military leaders and troops just so they wouldn't see you in your normal life. They wouldn't see you when you let your guard down and you could keep up this image. I think in today's world, people have taken the idea of image and performative to an information technology level that is not valuable. I think we start to confuse celebrity with character. I think we start to confuse wealth with leadership. I think we start to confuse power with values. And I don't think they necessarily equate. And so I think what we need to do is starts with ourselves. We have to look ourselves in the mirror and try to tell that person who you are. Because it's interesting, if you think about character sometimes, somebody you don't like does something despicable. And if you're petty like me, you kind of celebrate it. I knew that person was a sleazebag, and they proved it. But what about somebody you really like and respect, and they do something that you're really disappointed with? And then we end up with a real tension, a challenge. How about even further? What if you get in a moment and you don't live up to who you thought you were? And you go to that moment thinking that you have a set of convictions and you've got the discipline, you've got all the character in the world. And in that moment, and you normally realize it pretty quickly afterward, you weren't that. And then the question is what happened? Is that your real character? Or was that a weak moment? How do you deal with that? And I think all of us have had some version of that in our lives. But if you hit these huge, what I call Plutarchian moments, how do we calculate that? How do we live with that?
Yeah. Well, you entered the United States Military Academy at 17 years of age. You spent 4 years there. And West Point motto, duty, honor, country, but also the ethics code of I will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate anyone who does. How did your 4 years there at West Point and those statements shape your character and your life?
It's really a great question because I was up at a private school that a young lady who worked with me had gone to, and she asked me to speak to up in New Jersey. And it is all centered around an honor code that was started in 1926. And it's really impressive. These kids just own it. At West Point, when I arrived, and they had the honor code, a cadet does not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. When I got there, I just sort of first accepted it. Okay, I won't lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate anyone who does. Now, they train you a little bit on what the toleration part means, because in reality, it means if your roommate lied about something and you don't actively report them, you are dismissed from the academy, and that's a pretty high bar. But we accepted it. And so I thought, all right, that's the way it ought to be. But over time, what you learn is the honor code is not designed to make people at West Point honest. It's designed to make people in the rest of their lives have something internalized in them that says, I have chosen a life of integrity. And you know, when you're at West Point, it's not that hard. To be honest, there aren't that many opportunities to lie, cheat, or steal. A few people did find some, but when you get out in the service, there are plenty of them. And they usually aren't big ones. They aren't a case of you're going to rob a bank. They're a case of you are going to quibble or equivocate on something. I had a battalion commander who one of my first battalion commanders, used to talk about values in this. And then one morning at the end of a quarter, we had to meet a re-enlistment goal, or he felt we had to meet a re-enlistment goal. So at 5:30 in the morning, he had a terrible soldier that was in my company who should have been thrown out. This is the 1970s Army, so when you think terrible, lower that standard. This guy should have been in jail, but he's a paratrooper. But the battalion commander at 5:30 in the morning has him brought to battalion headquarters and lifts a bar to re-enlistment we had put on the soldier, a prohibition from re-enlisting, without telling our first sergeant or company commander, and re-enlists the soldier to make the quota. And I remember just in the moment, to me that was as representative of the kind of organization I didn't want to be in that I could think of. But those things are around you. And so suddenly you don't have, stiff uniforms and collars and strict people keeping you in line. Suddenly you got to keep yourself in line. And suddenly, years later, you're on the battlefield and you're dealing with difficult political events, or you're dealing with really complicated issues, and you hope that what they planted took.
Mm-hmm. Well, everybody was pretty familiar with those two sayings from the West Point, but you also have another saying that you talk about in the book, embrace the suck. What actually does that mean, and why does embrace the suck, why is that important?
Well, it's funny, because if you guys could see Bill McRaven and Joe Maguire here right now, they're upbeat, and you say, why wouldn't it be? It's a nice night, this is a great place, this is a wonderful gathering. The problem with people in really elite units is they're always that way. It's just irritating as hell. Literally, it's this forced thing, but then it becomes a habit. You go out, if it's raining, people will say, it's raining. If it's raining really hard, they'll go, hey, this is great. And of course, it's a little bit of theater, performative, because it's what people expect you to do, but it is something that rubs off on young soldiers, which is because if they see their leaders doing that, if they see the sergeant freezing, come walking up, feet cold in the rain, that kind of thing, looking at you saying, hey, trooper, this is great, isn't it? And the trooper goes, well, either he's crazy or I'm supposed to think it's great. And usually the soldier goes, I admire him, so I buy it. And so embrace the suck to me is something that if you can't change it, why whine about it? Mm-hmm. Just live with it. Now, if you can change something, maybe you ought to. If you got an umbrella, put it up. But, but it's really important. And I think we go through life right now. I would argue that we have a victim mentality in our country. Not everybody, but it's more widespread than it should be. Think how often people are outraged now. Something happens and I'm outraged. Okay. What good is that? And I think that the more we act outraged, the more we just make ourselves miserable. Sometimes you just go, okay, is what it is. Let's move on.
Yeah. You dedicate the book with admiration to all those who live a life of character, and with encouragement to all of us who fall short but continue to try. We all make mistakes and stumble in the area of character. How do you personally find your way back when you don't actually meet the mark that you set for yourself?
Yeah. And it's funny, I fail to meet the mark every day, every single day. There is some interaction, there is something I do, some comment I make, some time when I deal with somebody where I am not the person I know I'm supposed to be. And it's really disappointing in the moment because you typically know it as you're doing it. Think about when you're rude to somebody at the counter of something, and they may deserve it, but it don't make it right. And I get frustrated and I communicate that, or some other case like that. I think the key is don't let that become the new norm, particularly when you get senior in an organization like the military. If you're an admiral, very few people come up and tell you to stop doing what you're doing. It just doesn't happen.
I'm a married man.
Yeah, that's an important, and wives ought to be on the battlefield with us, because I know Andy would have gone, don't do that. But the reality is you need to be your own policing. And sometimes you can get examples from people even much junior to you who are just living to a standard and you go, wow, that shames me. But other times you've just got to find it inside. And so understand you're going to fail and understand that you've got to rise back up. You know, if you read the stories of prisoners of war from Vietnam, and from every war, but particularly Vietnam, they would be tortured and broken. And almost anybody can be broken, be forced to sign something or say something you didn't think you would. And the entire intent is to break down your sense of dignity and self-worth. Because the idea is if you can be broken once, you will no longer respect yourself to the same degree you did before. And it becomes a corrosive process until the person no longer values themselves, no longer has great pride. And that's why the importance of fellow prisoners immediately getting with someone and saying, hey, happens to all of us. Go back, right back and start over. And I think that's the way in life. I think you're going to make big mistakes in life. Almost everybody will. Some of which you're really ashamed of later. But the reality is, I think you've just got to step back and say, well, I won't do that again.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Stan. You're right. People truly worthy of our emulation are rare, but important. You define heroism as the result of measured actions over time that cumulatively constitute a level of behavior that sets a person apart far and above those we usually expect. By that definition, who are those you uphold as heroes and truly worthy of our emulation?
Yeah, it's funny. I think we all served with people like that. And of course, I won't embarrass you and Bill by saying that, but the reality is you do see it over time. And you can see it in physical courage on a battlefield. But the reality is most people, rise to that. That's not really what I'm talking about. Imagine people being brought into really difficult meetings and pressure going on, and you know what the person who's pressuring you wants to hear, and then you know what the reality is, and you know what your responsibility is to say. And they're often very different. And there is this tremendous pressure, particularly when you get very senior, in the Oval Office, for example. There's a vortex of pressure. And Mark would understand more. It's the ultimate home field advantage. And you go in there and several things happen. First, everybody in there wants to make you feel like you're an imposter. So they put their feet up and they go, like they're there every day. And I felt like an imposter the few times I was there. But then you want to get along. You want to be accepted. And it's smart people. And if they're all thinking maybe we ought to do X, not Y, you're thinking, wow, maybe they're right. And there's great pressure to say, yeah, I agree with X. But if you don't, the whole purpose of you being in that room is to give your honest opinion, your expertise. That's why you exist. That's why you're in that job. That's why you're in that room. And so the people that I saw that have that kind of courage, and you'd be in meetings and you'd suddenly see them. Bill Garrison used to command JSOC before Bill and I did, was just extraordinary that way. He was the commanding general during Mogadishu. And that was obviously a confused, messy gunfight, as he described it afterward. But when he went to testify in front of Congress, they asked him a number of questions designed to have him criticize Defense Department leadership for not being provided some of the weaponry that they thought he needed. And it was, people had an agenda. And he looked at him and he said, I was in command. I was in charge. If you're looking for somebody who's responsible, look at me, period. And that was extraordinary. And so when I see people like Bill Garrison, and then there was a sergeant major that I worked with for many years, Mike Hall, and some of the people in the room know him, and he just automatically says what he thinks is the truth. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have to think about it. And I think all of us, most of us, end up saying, wow, should I be courageous in this moment? And people like that just, no. Yeah. They are always that.
Well, I'd like to just add that Bill Garrison is a Texan from Hyco, Texas, so
of course.
No doubt. But you opened the book about, standing in your uniform in the White House and going in and having the meeting with the president. But from what you just mentioned about Bill Garrison, I have to reflect and think that you pretty much were in the same position. I mean, I've had a discussion sometime after you resigned with Secretary Gates. And he mentioned to me that he did an IG investigation after it, and that you were completely exonerated from any of the things that were said in Rolling Stone magazine. But the same way, you were in charge and you were in command. Would you say that was the same thing that complied with, hey, accountability, total responsibility, and the captain goes down with the ship?
I think it does. I don't put myself on the same plane with Bill Garrison, but I would say that in my case, for people who don't know it, what happened in the summer of 2010 is an unflattering article about my command team in Afghanistan came out in Rolling Stone magazine. So I canceled my subscription. Brought them to their knees. But what happened was immediately, there was already some political tension, new administration, there were a lot of things swirling. Never anything between President Obama and I. But anyway, this article came out and it said that we were sort of locker room, ill-disciplined, and we referred to the vice president in all unflattering ways. And I didn't even know if the article was accurate. I mean, I read it. As soon as I read it, I said, this is bad. The title was The Runaway General. And that's not good. And so regardless of whether it was accurate or unfair or how I felt about it, I'm in command. I'm responsible. And I'm not supposed to put problems on the president's desk like that. So flew back overnight from Kabul to D.C. and in the morning reported to the White House to meet with the president. Went in, he asked me, and he was very professional. It was great. He goes, what happened? And I said, I'm not quite sure. It's only been, 36 hours or so. I'm not sure, but I brought my resignation because I'm responsible. And if you want to accept my resignation, I'm fine with that. And if you want to tell me to go back in command, I'm fine with that too, whatever is right for the mission. And he accepted my resignation. And people talk to me and they say, wow, that was a difficult decision. It wasn't a difficult decision. It was a very easy decision. I was responsible, and I accept that. It was a painful decision. I wish I hadn't had to offer it. I wish he hadn't had to accept it or any of those things. But the two are different. And so to me, when you see the opportunity to do what you know is your responsibility, That's just what you do.
Yeah. Thank you, Stan.
Well, thanks.
You've talked about rewarding character in others. Can you share an example of when, either in uniform or after uniform, that you've actually rewarded people for demonstrating character?
Yeah. Probably not as much as we should have. We rewarded them for performance. Mm-hmm. We rewarded people for success. But sometimes you just didn't recognize character because there's not a U.S. Army medal that says character. Maybe there ought to be. But we had this long search for a leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, which finally culminated in June of 2006 with us being able to target and kill him. But it was based on the work of a whole number of people over about 2.5 years. But in the last 60 or so days, there was this intelligence sergeant, kind of looked like a duffel bag. And we'd be in these meetings, and there was this tremendous pressure because we were trying to put a lot of assets to follow, to close the loop and follow this set of suspects that we had. And by putting all those assets on, we were not covering some other things and gave al-Qaeda in Iraq opportunity to be doing operations we might have stopped. And so there was this great pressure to go on and strike and to capture the spiritual advisor, who's the guy we're watching, bring him in so we could question him. And this intelligence sergeant was convinced that we needed to step back, be patient, watch him, and let him lead us to Zarqawi. And every day we had a repetitive meeting every day, strike or hold. And every day I'm sort of like, hey, let's strike today. How about today? What do you think? Should we do it? And every day he's going, hey, General, kind of calm down. Hang on. We got to take our time. And at any point, the lead could have been lost, in which case we would have had to start over again, which would have been really painful. And then he would have been, criticized by people for that. But it took incredible character for an NCO in an organization of big personalities under a lot of pressure to do that. And so after the mission succeeded the next day, I flew down to Baghdad and we gave one award, and it was to him. And I think everybody in the organization thought that was appropriate. And it should have been for character.
That's a great story, Stan. Thank you for sharing that. Ben Franklin's famous quote, "A republic, if we can keep it," was said at the end of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in response to a lady who asked him what form of government the delegates had created. The phrase highlights Franklin's belief that the republic depends on the informed involvement and character of its citizens to survive. All of those folks from 1787 are gone. Yeah. Next year, we'll celebrate America's 250th birthday. How would you describe the character of our nation at this point, and can we keep the republic?
Yeah. And I'm not sure everyone in the room will agree with me. I think we're at a very difficult, dangerous point. If I think about it, just about everyone in this room became an American citizen by accident of birth. We didn't do anything for it. And since then, many people have served in many ways, but to a great degree, many Americans think if they pay their taxes and they vote, that they've sort of checked the box and they've done all demanded of them as a citizen. And yet, only 65% of eligible voters voted in the last presidential election, so we're not even voting at the rate that we probably should. I think we've gotten complacent. I think we take it for granted. I think we think that the American Republic, which was created so painfully and crafted so carefully, is something that the Lord God came down and created it, and so thus it has always been and it always will be. And I don't think that's true. I think America is only as good as we are right now, and we're as bad as we let ourselves be. So I think it almost goes back to taking the republic for granted, taking our responsibilities as citizens for granted. not appreciating just how hard it was, not just militarily to get independence, but to craft something that 13 colonies would agree to. That was really difficult. And we've gone through a pretty painful history at times, obviously a civil war, but other stresses and strains. And I think that if we take our republic for granted, then suddenly we will one day find out it's not as strong as either we thought it was or it needs to be. And so I think that the kinds of things that happen at presidential libraries, the kind of scholarship that goes on, the kind of appreciation that's embedded in people is, the reality is this isn't a given. There's nothing in history that says the American Republic survives. In fact, there's everything in history that says it doesn't, because no other entity has ever survived indefinitely. So I think it's very serious, and I think what we've got to do is step back and treat it seriously. Meaning, I think we've got to treat how we treat fellow citizens. I think we need to reconsider that. I think we need to consider how we treat our politics, what we demand of our politicians, what we demand of the decorum and the norms and the standards in our society, because we get what we demand. And if we don't demand it, we will get something different from what I would argue that we need and that we want. And so that's why I just think it's so important. And I don't think there's either side is right or wrong right now. It kind of doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. It's almost like we're high school kids who got a bunch of beer, we're in the basement, and suddenly mom and dad came home. You didn't go through that? Yeah. They turn the lights on and everybody sobers up quickly. Well, maybe we need to do that. The adults need to come in and turn the lights on.
Stan, you spend a good part of the book on Gettysburg.
Yeah.
Can you tell us why this place resonates with you and why Gettysburg should matter to all of us?
Yeah. I'm going to tell two quick stories there, because first, Gettysburg is a special place to me. But in the summer of 2005, we went to Gettysburg. Bill was there. Georgianne was there. We brought the commanders from JSOC there and to do an offsite, because we were at war and many of the people were forward, and we got them together for 2.5 days. And during those 2.5 days, a couple things happened. First, the guys, if you remember the movie Lone Survivor, the operation that was happened. And so to a great degree, we were coordinating that from the second floor of this hotel in Gettysburg. Not the first part of the operation, but the relief part. But also, I got this call and said, come down to the White House and tell the president why you haven't captured or killed Abu Musab al-Zarqawi yet. So in the middle of this thing, they picked me up from a helicopter in Gettysburg, flew me down to the White House and had me explain to the president and whatnot. And he was great, but it was a reminder in the moment of, we were at a pivotal point. We were in a pretty desperate fight then. And I've got a photograph of the gathering that made it so special. But Gettysburg is something that to me is a little different than many other or most other events in U.S. history, particularly military history. It was 2.5 years into the Civil War. So all of the participants knew it wasn't going to be a short, easy war. There had already been a tremendous number of casualties. Most of the dilettantes had left. It was down to people who were committed. Most of the people there were volunteers. There were very few draftees that took part in it. And about 150,000 Americans, divided about, not roughly in half, but close to that, tried to kill each other, tried to rip the guts out of their opponent's army. And these are two armies with the same history, the same religion, the same basic culture. And we step back and we go, on the one hand, there was courage, there was leadership, there was sacrifice, there was all the noble things that war does elicit from people. And it should be celebrated and it should be remembered, because those are times when you bring out sometimes some of the best. But we need to understand we also bring out the worst. In the days after Gettysburg, all of the buildings in Gettysburg, in the town, were filled with wounded hospitals. They had to go hire local workers to bury people, and they just buried them under about 3 inches of dirt initially, and then they moved them several months later. I mean, just the scope of this. And we say, how could two civilized countries be in the middle of a civil war that took 650,000 Americans, made 650,000 casualties, but meet on a battlefield like this and just try to destroy each other? And then, of course, if we learn, you can go to YouTube and watch videos of the 1913 and 1938 reunions. There were still living veterans, and they did some really memorable pictures of Confederate and Union veterans standing at the critical point on Cemetery Ridge shaking hands 75 years later. And so I think it's a place that we need to remember, we need to study, we need to understand, and in some ways we need to celebrate, but not in a two-dimensional, simplistic way. A way that if we let things get that bad, it does require extraordinary sacrifice, and that's what should be celebrated.
Thank you, Stan. As you look to challenges we face at home and abroad during a turbulent time, what do you consider to be the greatest threat to our country?
In 1838, 29-year-old Abraham Lincoln gave a speech in Springfield, Illinois. And as part of his speech, he answered the question of what threat should America worry about? And he writes it beautifully, and he said, in 1,000 years, the hosts of Europe and Africa and Asia, led by a Bonaparte, couldn't reach the Ohio River. We will never be conquered by a foreign power. But he continues, he says, but if it is our fate to die, it will be by national suicide. He's 29 years old, 1838, and he nailed it. That's what I think our great danger is. There's nobody in the world, I mean, you could have, nuclear war or something, but there's not other competitors or even combination of competitors that cause me to have great fear. Now, you pay attention to it. What causes me to have great fear goes back to what we talked about, a republic if we can keep it. Do we value what we have enough so that we protect it? And that means that there are some things you have to compromise on that aren't everything you want. Just the way life is. And if we can't do that, then I don't know that we can be united enough and effective enough in all the things we have to do to remain the kind of country we want to be. I think it's completely within our grasp. I'm not one of these people saying it's all over. I'm one of these people saying we have agency, we have control, we have the ability to do it. We just need to do it. And I don't see us doing it enough yet.
You refer to many eminent philosophers on character. However, one seems to resonate with you more than others, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius. He was well loved by his people and a combat leader. What impresses you about the wisdom, and I'll add, character of this philosopher king?
The thing about Marcus Aurelius is he's a practical guy. He is not, when I was younger and you were assigned to read philosophy in high school and then in college, if you read it, go, well, this is great, but it's not everyday practical. As I put in the book, if these guys had been in my junior high school, they'd have gotten beaten up and their lunch money taken. But they had a lot to say. Marcus Aurelius was not that. Marcus Aurelius was an extraordinary combat leader, national leader, but he was also one of these people, and if you read Meditations, he didn't write it for you and I. He wrote it for himself. And he didn't write this well-crafted guidebook that says, okay, Marcus, do this, do this, do this. It's a number of conclusions that he goes through, and some of the ones that just resonate to me. He talks about why should you do something that's right as opposed to do something that's wrong. If it is in your interest to do what's wrong, if you get some kind of profit from it or advantage or whatever, why wouldn't you just do that? And he says, well, you might do it because you want people to think you're a good person and your legacy will be good and they will remember you well. And then he reminds you, he says, but everybody who remembers you, they're going to die too. And then the people who remember them are going to die. So there is no point in doing something for the legacy and the enduring honor of it. But he circles back, he says, but the point that should drive us is we do it simply because it's right. Not because someone tells us to, not because we get approval, not because we even feel better about it. It shouldn't be that human. It ought to be, did you ever give money around Christmas to somebody and you know that it helped them, but it helped you? It made you feel good. And so I think I do it, and I think we should do it. But I almost wish I was the person that just automatically did it because it was just right and I didn't think about it. I didn't want any credit even in my own mind for it. And that's the kind of thing that he argues.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of death, you begin this book discussing the limited amount of words that will appear on your tombstone at Arlington and what you want them to read. How would you answer that question? What would you want your tombstone to read?
I used to make my students at Yale write their own obituary. And for like 20-year-old Yale students, that freaked them out. And I said, it's not for next week, but No, this is a great question. You get 11 lines on your standard issue headstone in Arlington. Annie's father and mother have the same headstone that my father and mother have. Her brother has the same one. And what it basically does, gives your name, it gives your when you were alive, birth and death. It gives whatever rank you achieved. It lists whatever wars you were in. That's about it. But you think about what more do you really need? I'd like to get an exception, put a poem on mine or something, but now I think that what I hope is when people come to my grave and they see it, most of them will have no idea who I was. Some will have served with me or been family or something, and they'll have some kind of story. I hope people just said it was a little better because he was here. He didn't fix it. He didn't leave it perfect forever. But while he was here, it was a little better than it would have been had he not been. And that would be pretty good.
Fifth and final book, Stan?
Done.
I've read 4 of his books, and it took the last chapter of his 5th book before I learned that you and I share the same birthday, and I've known him for 35 years. So I owe you a lot of birthday cards.
Right.
Why is this your last, Stan?
One, they're a lot of work. I think there's a danger if you run out of stuff to say. You ever notice people who overstay their welcome in anything? They're in politics and they do pretty well, and then they retire and then they come back for one more season in the sun. And I'm not saying that I had seasons in the sun. I'm just saying at a certain point, it's time for other people to do it. It's time for me to think about stuff. So I can't see me writing. Mm-hmm. I may write painful op-eds or something, criticizing people, but.
Well, I've thought about my tombstone, and I've told Kathy this before. I'm just going to have on it, damn it, I knew this would happen. All right. In closing, former Vice President Dick Cheney's funeral was held today. His tenure as vice president is often called the most powerful vice presidency in America's history. His daughter, Liz Cheney, eulogized her father as knowing that bonds of party must always yield to the single bond that we share as Americans. I think we can all agree with that statement. Do you have any thoughts on the passing of the former Vice President?
I think that to the extent I knew him personally, I had great regard for him and I enjoyed working with him. And I think that's true. I mean, he had strong feelings about things, but I think it started with strong feelings about being an American. Mm-hmm. And I think that there was a time, and there have been times in American political history when people could be diametrically opposed and yet absolutely aligned on the idea that they were patriotic Americans and they were after a compromise. And that's just the way we ought to function. They used to say that domestic politics should end at the water's edge, and we should never carry our domestic politics overseas in our foreign policy. And I sign up to that too. So I think he was, unfortunately, because of the period with Iraq and everything, people tend to almost do a bumper sticker analysis of Vice President Cheney, and I think he deserves more than that.
Yeah. Well, Stan, on behalf of the LBJ Foundation, the Clements Center for National Security, the University of Texas, and everyone here, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Jeff. That was